Ran away from him. It's been comin' for a long time, and now it's here. Barry, I'm takin' no start on you. Stand away from the girl and pull your gun, and I'll pump you full of lead." The softest of soft voices murmured behind her: "I been waitin' for you, Buck, days and days and days. I ain't never been so glad to see anybody." And she felt Barry slip shadow like to one side. She sprang in front of him again with a wild cry. "Buck," she begged, "don't shoot!" Laughter, ringing and unhuman, filled the throat of Buck Daniels. "Is it him you're beggin' for?" he sneered at her. "Is it him you got your fears for? Ain't you got a word of pity for Buck Daniels that sneaked off like a whipped puppy? Bah! Dan Barry, the time has come. I've been leading the life of a hound dog for your sake, but it's ended. Pull your gun and get out from behind the skirts of that girl." As long as they faced each other with the challenge in their eyes, nothing on earth could avert the fight, she knew. But if she could delay them for one moment, she felt that swift moving form behind her slipping away from behind her, and she could follow Barry's movements by the light in Daniels' eyes. "Buck," she cried, "for God's sake, for my sake, turn away from him and roll another cigarette." For she remembered the story, how Daniels had turned under the very nose of danger and done this insane thing in the saloon at Brownsville, and in her despair she could think of no other appeal. It was the very strangeness of it that gave it point. Buck Daniels turned on his heel. "It's the last kindness I do you, Dan," he said, with his broad back to them. "But before you die you got to know why I'm killin' you. I'm goin' to roll one cigarette and smoke it, and while I smoke it I'm goin' to tell you the concentrated truth about your worthless self, and when I'm done smokin' I'm goin' to turn around and drop you where you stand. D'you hear?" "There's no need of waitin'," answered the soft voice of Barry. "Talkin' don't mean much." But Kate Cumberland turned and faced him. He was fairly aquiver with eagerness, and the hate welled and blazed and flickered in his eyes. His face was pale, very pale, and it seemed to her that she could make out in the pallor the print of the fingers of Buck Daniels, and that blow those many days before, and she feared him as she had never feared him before, and yet she blocked his way still with the outspread arms. They could hear the crinkle of cigarette paper as Buck Daniels rolled his smoke. "No," said Buck, his voice suddenly altered to almost a casual moderation. "Talk don't mean nothin' to you. Talk is human, and nothin' human means nothin' to you. But I got to tell you why you ought to die, Barry. I started out this morning hating the ground you walked on, but now I see there ain't no use to hate you. Is they any use in hating a mountain lion that kills calves? No, you don't hate it, but you get a gun and trail it and shoot it down, and that's the way with you." They heard the scratch of his match. "That's the way with you. I got my back to you right now, because if I looked you in the eye I couldn't let you live no more than I could let a mountain lion live. I know you're faster with your gun than I am, and stronger than I am, and made to fight. But I know I'm going to kill you. You've done your work. You've left hell on all sides of you. It's your time to die. I know it. You've been lying like a snake in the rocks with your poison ready for any man that walks past you. Now your poison is about used up." He paused, and then when he spoke again there was a ring of exultation in his voice. "I tell you, Dan, I don't fear you. And I know that the bullet in this gun here on my hips is the one that's going to tear your heart out. I know it." Something like a sob came from the lips of Dan Barry. His hands moved out towards Buck Daniels as though he were plucking something from the empty air. "You've said enough," he said. "You've said plenty. Now turn around and fight." And Kate Cumberland stepped back out of the line of the two. She knew that in what followed she could not play the part of the protector or the delayer. Here they stood, hungry for battle, and there was no power in her weak hands to separate them. She stood far back and fumbled with her hands at the wall for support. She tried to close her eyes, but the fascination of the horror forced her to watch against her strongest will. And the chief part of that dreadful suspense lay in the even, calm voice of Buck Daniels as he went on: "I'll turn around and fight soon enough. But Kate asked me to smoke another cigarette. I know what she means. She wants me to leave you the way I done in the saloon that day. I ain't going to leave, Dan. But I'm glad she asked me to turn away, because it gives me a chance to tell you some things you got to know before you go west. Dan, you've been like a fire that burns every hand that touches you." He inhaled a long breath of smoke and blew it up towards the ceiling. "You've busted the heart of the friend that followed you. You've busted the heart of the girl that loves you." He paused again for another long inhalation, and Kate Cumberland, staring in fearful suspense, waiting for the instant when Buck should at last turn and when the shots should explode, saw the yellow glow was now somewhat misted in the eyes of Barry. He frowned as one bewildered. "Think of her, Dan," went on Buck Daniels. "Think of her wasting herself on a no-good hound dog like you, a no-good wild wolf. My God Almighty, she might have made some man happy, some man with a soul and a heart. But instead of that God sent you like a blast across her, you with your damn soul of wind and your heart of stone. Think of it. When you see what you've been, Barry, I wonder you don't go out and take your own gun and blow off your head." "Buck," called Dan, "so help me God, if you don't turn your face to me I'll shoot you through the back." "I knew," said the imperturbable Daniels, "that you'd come to that in the end. You used to fight like a man, but now you're following your instincts and you fight like a hunting wolf. Look at the brute that's slinking up to me there. That's what you are. You kill for the sake of killing like the beasts. If you was a man could you treat me like you've done? Your damned cold heart and your yellow eyes and all would have burned up in the barn the other night. You and your wolf and your damned horse. Why didn't I let you burn? Because I was a fool. Because I still thought there was something of the man in you. But I seen afterwards what you was, and I rode off to get out of your way, to keep your hands from getting red with my blood. And then you plan on following me, damn you, and following me. So that, Dan, is why I've come to put you out of the world, as I'm going to do now. Once you hated to give pain, and if you hurt people it was because you couldn't help it. But now you live on torturing others. Barry, pull your gun." As he spoke he whirled, the heavy revolver leaping into his hand. Still Kate Cumberland could not close her eyes on the horror. She could not even cry out. She was frozen. But there was no report, no spurt of smoke, no form of a man stumbling blindly towards death. Dan Barry stood with one hand pressed over his eyes and the other dangled at his side, harmless, while he frowned in bewilderment at the floor. He said slowly at length: "Buck, I kind of think you're right. There ain't no use in me. I've been remembering, Buck, how you sent Kate to me when I was sick." There was a loud clatter. The revolver dropped from the hand of Buck Daniels. The musical voice of Dan Barry murmured again: "And I remember how you stood up to Jim Silent for my sake. Buck, what's come between us since them days? You hit me a while back, and since then I've been wanting your blood. But hearing you talk now, somehow I feel sort of lost and lonesome, like I've thrown something away that I valued most." Buck Daniels threw out his great arms, and his voice broke terribly. "Oh, God Almighty, Dan," he cried, "just take one step back to me, and I'll come all the way around the world to meet you." He stumbled across the floor and grasped at the hand of Barry, for a mist half blinded his eyes. "Dan," he pleaded, "ain't things as they once was? Do you forgive me?" "Why, Buck," murmured Dan Barry in that same bewildered fashion, "seems like we was bunkies once." "Dan," muttered Buck Daniels, choking, "Dan." But he dared not trust his voice further, and turning he fairly fled from the room. The dazed eyes of Dan Barry followed him. Then they moved until they encountered the face of Kate Cumberland. A shock as if of surprise,